There we go. Hello and welcome. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for what I feel is a very important discussion. I know everybody's incredibly busy, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. I also want to thank our speakers who are making this discussion possible today. Nobody is being paid to be here, and they're all taking part because they think this is an important topic, and I hope you do as well. Before we get going, I'm just going to do a little housekeeping. During the discussion, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat. We have people monitoring who can respond where appropriate, and if we have time at the end, we'll pick up anything we didn't cover. Any questions or proposals after the fact can be directed to answers@limacharlie.io. My name is Christopher Luft. I'm one of the founders of LimaCharlie. We make security infrastructure as a service, which is basically AWS for security. And I'm going to leave it at that because I'm not here to pitch a product, but rather to facilitate the discussion moving cybersecurity towards an engineering-centric future. This topic's near and dear to my heart. I'm educated as a computer scientist and spent most of my career as a developer before going down the security rabbit hole about 5 years ago. I was and am still shocked by how far behind cybersecurity is as an industry when compared to the progress and evolution of software engineering practices around scaling, DevOps, CI/CD, and just about anything else. I know there are some historical reasons for this, and I'm hoping that this conversation will shed some light on how we go from where we are to a future that is better for the industry as a whole. And with that, I'm going to ask our speakers to introduce themselves, starting with Larry, then Joe, and then Maxime. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Christopher, and thanks for having me here today. So my name is Larry Maccherone. I currently work for Contrast Security. We have, I believe, the best platform for application security testing, automated application security testing, especially in a developer-first sort of environment. Prior to joining Contrast, though, I was the head of DevSecOps transformation for Comcast. And over the course of 5 years, I actually transitioned 600 development teams from sort of traditional ways of doing application security to more of a taking ownership of the security of their own products approach. That's my definition essentially of DevSecOps. I'm also an active developer like you, Christopher. I went down the rabbit hole of security 20 years ago, and then I escaped the hole 5 years later because I got frustrated that there weren't enough developers sort of participating. I went back to the development world and did agile transformations. And then 6 years ago, I got sucked back down the rabbit hole, as you put it, with my role at Comcast being the start of that. So, Joe.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, I want to second what Larry said. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present here with you guys today. A little bit about me. My name is Joe Anderson. I'm the senior cybersecurity analyst at a company called TechSolve. Really, my role there is a security consultant where I help manufacturers meet security and governance and compliance objectives. Prior to that, I've spent over 25 years in IT and cybersecurity, where I've worked within different managed service providers supporting manufacturing, healthcare, and finance. I'm probably the least one qualified to probably speak on this because I do not come from an AppSec dev perspective, but I do work with those folks as a part of my regular role in trying to ensure that we're keeping an eye on security and that we're trying to drive a better security posture overall.
Awesome. So I'm Max, co-founder at LimaCharlie. My background has been security my whole career, and I started in the intelligence community here in Canada, and then made my way to some CrowdStrike in the early days, Google internal security, and then a bit more recently, what eventually became Chronicle Security at Google. So I've done a lot of development. I've done a lot of operations as well. And I think it's really exciting to, this very specific group, because honestly, we kind of have like the three different points of view of a similar problem set, which is engineering is really, like Chris was saying, a really important thing for us to get going in security. And certainly the app side of things, like how do we build things securely? But I think equally interesting is sort of from the operational side. How does engineering come in from that side as well? So I think we're all seeing different sides of that same medal, and it'll be really interesting.
Great. Thanks, you guys. Larry, I'm going to get you to start things off, and I'm going to ask you to kind of, where are we as an industry today in cybersecurity?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with essentially a little bit of a story of how we got to where we are. Perfect. From the perspective of sort of the shift towards developer-centric AppSec. So if you go back to the agile movement, the agile movement was a lot of things, but among them was this idea of cross-functional teams, such that teams took ownership of the whole life cycle of delivering value with software to their clients who were using the users of their software. And so that included sort of breaking down the silos with the previously throw it over the wall QA group, as well as the previously throw it over the wall product management group. And the QA group, I think, is sort of the most relevant. If you look today, there's no sort of C-level QA people there were back then. There's no dedicated QA departments that sort of take throw it over the wall, or very few left. And they're dwindling. The roles are really all, even if they have a department, the people in that department are actually assigned to a team long-term and participate in that development team's planning and execution cycles. And so basically the development team took ownership of the quality of their products. You fast forward to the DevOps movement and the cloud native movement, and a similar thing happened with ops. Developers could get a new server with 3 clicks on AWS, and so they did, and they basically had shadow IT. And that was a derogatory term for what we now call cloud native, right? but it was considered a negative back then, and I think that's sort of interesting because that's similar to what we're now starting to see with DevSecOps. And the security group is sort of the next group to get the silo broken down. And I actually don't like that phrase nearly as much as get the development team to take ownership of, or more ownership of, in the case of both ops and cybersecurity. I don't think it's really possible for them to take complete ownership of it, but the majority of ownership of either of those things is possible nowadays, even in large enterprises. And that was essentially what I did at Comcast, is I basically shifted to that way of doing it. Now, Comcast is ahead of the curve. So if you want to say where we are today, we're sort of just at the very beginning stages of that shift to developer-centric application security. It's still mostly done by security specialists, and it's still largely a little sort of siloed, if not completely throw it over the wall at this point.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So developer-centric versus engineering-centric. Max, do you want to take a shot at trying to define what we mean when we say engineering-centric?
Yeah. So I think again, as an industry, security is growing a ton, and I think what it means is that there's no such thing as just security anymore, and the core groups here are becoming more and more different. So I think that engineering approach, what Larry is really kind of digging in, is from and correct me if I'm wrong, but is really from the app development. So if I think in terms of a life cycle, right, it's sort of the beginning of the life cycle where, hey, as we're developing software and infrastructure, let's do this in a secure way. And in my mind, then there's also that second half of the process, which I think is where Joe will have more experience as well, which is, hey, as those things live in the real world and things are evolving and things are happening, sometimes, something happens that not that it wasn't caught, but it couldn't have been caught sometimes, from the development, the secure development side of things. And how do we do that second half? And I think that second half is sort of where this engineering approach is even farther back in terms of evolution, because we're still dealing with a lot of arcane knowledge, right? People doing incident response or doing investigation are looking very much at this from the perspective of like, hey, what's my experience? How do I like doing these things? And that's great. Like, everybody's got to start there, right? But to me, that engineering approach means that as an industry, we have to start to look at it not in terms of how does one person or one group of people want to approach this topic, but rather how do we make this a best practices replicatable across different organizations? It's kind of like, I think about it like the scientific method, right? How do we put sort of a framework around this so that as an industry, we can learn to grow and get better? So that's how I think about it. I'm curious, Joe, what do you think about it? Like, does that match with your?
Yeah, so from my experience, right, how we got here, I think the explosive growth of the internet, and a lot of ideas and different things were brought out pretty quickly. It's such a fast-paced environment. So I do want to be be aware of what the challenges are from a development perspective. But, shortcuts have had to be made, right, which results potentially in insecure code. And borrowing from insecure areas, different libraries and different modules that may have to be used in order to get something stood up properly. Using, different methods of trying to find and identify where there could be some of these insecurities takes a whole tribe approach. Before, I think, Larry was saying, one of the big challenges is we have such a small, reduced workforce. We don't have the teams that we used to have. So we're relying on less people to do more things. And then we need to reduce those barriers, right? So we have cybersecurity sitting over here. We have dev folks over here. And oftentimes the cybersecurity folks are left out of those conversations, because oftentimes I think it's viewed that maybe we stifle the innovation, or we're going to create barriers for them, and really maybe it appears that way, but really we have to have a seat at the table in order to be able to help. We need the development folks as much as they need us and our input. So that's kind of my 2 cents thinking on kind of what the challenges are, how we got here, and kind of how we can start trying to approach this issue with an engineering mindset.
That's interesting, and it reminds me of something Larry said the other day, actually, when we were talking about how security is there to support business, because without the business, there's no need for security. So it's always this push and pull between the interests and the business, right?
It is.
Yeah, one of the sort of tenets of sort of my whole framework, and I love, Max, that you mentioned framework. I have this side project in addition to my job at Contrast called transformation.dev. And basically it's a framework for getting from wherever you are now to very high levels of software engineering and security and DevOps. I really do like that concept of a framework. And I really think it's key to have this shallow on-ramp for that framework. If you just say, here's an audit of the 300-page policy manual, the team just goes, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. It's overwhelming. I'm just going to wait till you make me do something. But instead, if you just say, here's 1 to 3 things that you could do in the next 90 days that would have the biggest impact, risk reduction impact, and you coach the team and you make it really easy for them to self-service do it, that's the way to actually make this happen. And so my framework is really less about the list of practices and more about sort of the way you get the framework for how you get teams to change their current behavior. And it's all about this gradual on-ramp, leveraging the psychology of developers and development and the sociology of development teams, and just giving them the next little bit, coaching and toolsmithing to make it easy for them to do it themselves.
And I really like this shallow on-ramp concept, because I think a topic that is, I'm thinking it's probably under discussed, very much along those lines, is security, right? I know it's a big topic. There's a lot of different folks doing different things, but security traditionally has been a community that's been very passionate about it, right? It's not, again, I don't mean anything against like accounting or anything like that, but like, it's not accounting that like, hey, it's been around for, I don't know, thousands of years. It's printing plates. So security has had a lot of very passionate people, and that has fueled innovation in security a whole lot. And I think the biggest danger or the biggest opportunity to try to optimize is for this maturity, right? This on-ramp, this framework, without losing some of that magic, right? Like how do we keep this as long as we can, because it has some positive associated with it?
Although I don't know, I mean, the way I like to sort of talk about this, what you just said, is basically the passionate security, especially researchers, they're advancing the state of the art. Yes. But the state of the practice is so far behind that it doesn't really help us very much to keep advancing the state of the art. We have to sort of like say, okay, great, keep going, you're doing great, but we're going to focus on getting the state of the practice, sort of like the least common denominator development team, to have sort of this bare minimum set of things that the security folks said you had to have 30 years ago. And we don't have today for the most part for this thing. So that's really been my focus.
I love that approach too of a framework, because oftentimes, how many times are we in front of a customer and we talk about, let's say it's specific governance and compliance controls, things like that. It's just too overwhelming. So how can we break this down? Because you're really trying to change behaviors, you're trying to foster new ways of thinking, trying to, chew the elephant in small bites at a time becomes very, very important. If you try to do everything at once, it's going to fail. So having some sort of framework or some sort of a marching orders of how you can get from point A to point B, I think is very, very important.
So I'll ask you guys then, what is stifling this? How come it hasn't kept up with the innovation in software engineering as a discipline and a profession? I talked to lots of security people and they all seem very knowledgeable and capable. Why are we still stuck using these black box tools and sort of it's something that I would say is driven by the vendors, not the engineers doing the work?
You want to take that first?
I mean, I have opinions. I think, and as a broad, high level statement, I would say it's a perfect storm of, as I kind of mentioned, I think the people traditionally have been very passionate people, and a lot of arcane knowledge, meaning it's not documented somewhere. It's not known as like the thing for everybody. So what that translated into is that from the vendor space, trying to communicate concretely the values of taking an engineering approach, has the ROI on trying to do that has been way lower than the ROI on just the big bad man, right? Like, oh, you're gonna get hacked by the APTs, like, and so I think it's just an industry optimization where like the path of least resistance for vendors has been traditionally to just lean on the fear side of things and not on the metrics, because on the metrics it's hard.
And also, there's another thing that happens at security organizations, especially in enterprises, is that they're running around with their pants on fire dealing with incidents. And it's really, really hard to do important preventive work when you have urgent response work. And so one of the keys to doing this successfully, I think, is to separate those people. And this was actually a huge hurdle I had to get over at Comcast is some of the people on my team were the most expert in a lot of the things that were related to a ongoing security incident. And so the folks responsible for that incident response would try to pull my people in. And I had to fight to say, no, we will gladly come in when you're doing the retrospective on how to prevent the next one like this. That's when you bring us in. But we are not pants on fire, because if we do, we will never focus on preventing them. And you talked about the metrics and convincing folks to do it and the ROI. Teams that actually went through my program, by the time I had 150 teams out of the 600 through the program, I had a ton of data. They had 1/6 as many incidents and vulnerabilities in production as the teams that did not go through the program. And so that basically argued for a reduction to 1/4 as many people over in that response reactive side of the world. And we needed a lot fewer people over on the sort of preventive side of the world that were sort of in my program. So there is a strong ROI, 1/4 the cost and 1/6 as much risks. So a 24x ROI is what I use to convince the organization to essentially say, let's get all 600 teams on this program instead of just the first 150.
I'm curious. Yeah, Joe, please go.
I was just going to add that I think the other component of this too is the lack of the departments being able to understand what each other is doing. And maybe that's an opportunity for leadership to step up and try to connect those disparate groups to where they are working closer together. I think over the years, we've seen more and more of different parts of the business working together, but trying to get cybersecurity and especially the developers together sometimes is very challenging. There's not a clear path straight across. So, continuing to remove these sort of barriers, I think is very crucial.
It's not just a communication problem. There's a lack of trust. I mean, a typical security person says things that lead me to believe, and sometimes they explicitly say this in candid moments, after a couple of beers, right? They'll say, those developers are just putting out crap that's going to get us hacked, but that's, what they're thinking. And it shows up in the way they relate to and they communicate with and interact with the developers. We have to police you because you won't do it on your own, which is the way the QA folks used to talk about development teams as well. Remember? And then the developers have the same thing. It's like those security people, they don't understand how software gets developed. They don't understand that we actually have to have features that we get out or we will have no customers. And it doesn't matter how secure we are if we have no customers, because there's no customer data to worry about protecting. And, so we have to have customers and we have to have revenue to fund this whole thing. And so we have these other concerns, and they don't even acknowledge that we have those other concerns. And so there's lack of trust, and that I think is really key, Joe, is how do you get over that trust barrier? I actually have an answer for that a little bit. It's not a complete answer, but I'll let somebody else sort of chime in unless you want to hear what my trust algorithm is, my building trust algorithm is.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to ramble on too much, though.
I'll bite.
So there's this consultant organization called the Trusted Advisor, and they have this formula for trust. And I've modified the formula a little bit, so I'm going to say my version, but it's completely recognizable. The trust is essentially a ratio where there's 3 things in the numerator and 1 thing in the denominator. The 1 thing in the denominator is apparent self-interest. And so this is why we naturally don't trust salespeople, because they're trying to sell you something so they can make their commission. So that denominator is big for when you're talking to a salesperson. And so you want the denominator to be as small as possible. And you do this by emphasizing shared interest. We both have developers, you have stock in the company, security people, we have stock in the company. We don't want to get hacked. It'll lower our market cap, our stock value. Shared interest. So that's how you deal with the denominator. The 3 terms in the numerator are credibility, reliability, and empathy. Sort of intimacy, I think, is the way the Trusted Advisor says it, but I actually like empathy better. But let's start with credibility. So you have to be credible to the person you're trying to build trust with. And so having a bunch of security people that don't know anything about development, or they did development 10 years ago or 5 years ago, even with the pace of change in the development world, is not going to build credibility. So you have to actually have people who are doing software development do this work. And so I hired Scrum Masters into my coaching role, and I hired active developers into my toolsmithing role. And my program was entirely staffed with those people. If you came to me with a resume that had just those acronyms for security certifications on it, you went to the bottom of the pile. If you also had development experience, I wanted to look at your code to see how good it was and recent it was. So that's credibility. Reliability is easy. It's just say, do what you say, make commitments and keep them. And then empathy is sort of how well you can relate to the pains that they have. And this helps also by having Scrum Masters and developers do this work as opposed to security specialists do this work. And so you can maximize trust by maximizing the terms in the numerator and minimizing the one term in the denominator.
I like it.
So do you think that means that if we look into the future that we see security, which is currently fairly siloed, and development kind of becoming one? Is that the vision of how this all works?
I don't think I can't see it completely replacing security specialists and security group. For instance, the having a group that is of security architects that not only know sort of the right things to do in general with things like encryption and authentication and access control, but that actually know the specific implementations of those things at your organization. We do SSO this way now. We used to do it that way, but we're deprecating that way. We're doing it this way now. So if you're developing a new app, you want to do it this way. And so having those people sort of be specialists in that area, I think we're going to always have those people. I think pen testing is a skill that isn't something that's likely to go away, or a function that's likely to ever go away. I think the areas of vulnerability management could completely disappear for application vulnerabilities, but then you have hardware and other things. So those folks need to stay around, but basically their scope narrows down. So I don't actually ever see it completely disappearing. But I think that the vast majority of risks that come from vulnerabilities in applications, 80-90% of that risk can actually be handled by the engineering team, and not a security specialist group.
And I would add that, referring back to what you were saying a little bit earlier around hiring people that have been developers, I think about it the same way when I think of that second half of that security spectrum, right?
I didn't say have been developers. They are developers on Friday, the day that I last talked to them, and they're a developer on my team on Monday. So if you want people to stay relevant, they have to stay actively developing. And so I had these people do development projects for 50% of their time. And then they did consulting with the clients, toolsmithing consulting with clients 50% of the time. Now, the development they did was essentially building self-service tools for the engineering team. So you have to stay developers because it doesn't take very long at all to get out of touch with what.
Absolutely. Yes, I totally agree. I think it's also something that's difficult to scale, right? I think the reality I suspect that a lot of people will feel is, I have a lot of. Sorry, let me take a step back. I totally agree. And I think about it the same way for that second half of security, meaning kind of I would call the operations side of things, right? Like everything after the development and like just the day-to-day. I do strongly believe that for somebody to really be able to investigate breaches, to do kind of this deep ongoing and investigation work, you have to have had some kind of background in development. The reality is, you're investigating something, you have to understand how it works. Now, the big challenge that I suspect a lot of people would raise is that's great in theory, but it's brutally difficult in practice because, if I'm a smaller shop and I'm trying to hire people that do both of these things, there's very few people that fit into these buckets, and finding the right people, that can kind of straddle that. Now, I don't think it means it's the wrong way to optimize it or to see it. But I want to call out that that's.
Here's the way to do it is it's very, very hard to teach a security specialist how to write code. It's much easier to teach a developer those few things he needs to know about security to do this kind of work, the toolsmithing kind of work that I'm talking about. The other thing that you said that I sort of will challenge is that, when you're doing deep incident analysis, that's when if you do it for the development team, it's sort of like, if I put my hand on this hot plate over here and you feel the pain, you're going to say, ouch. And you're going to tell me to stop putting my hand on the hot plate. But I'm going to go, oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'll try not to do that again. But then the next time I do it, if you separate the incident response work from the folks who are basically doing what caused the incident, writing hackable code, then you actually don't get this pain feedback loop. So I actually really strongly advocate, and I didn't pull this off completely, but I got a lot of it to happen. I strongly advocated for our incident response people to act more like project managers, and the development team to commit. They will participate in the analysis and to figure out what happened, and that got them to actually feel ownership of the problem more than they would if somebody did it for them. And they actually do know how the software is written. And so they might pretend like they don't know how hacks happen, but they very quickly pick up on it when it's something that they care about, which is the code we wrote, that we own. It's our baby. We care about it. Yeah. And so I didn't see that problem. The thing that sort of helped me at Comcast is that we had a kicker for people who had worked in security. So if you were an engineer developer that worked in security, you made more money than an engineer who didn't work in security. So, it was easy to get engineers to essentially switch sides, especially because we told them you were going to keep writing code on Monday after you started. So,
yeah, I like to teach a person to fish approach, right? I mean, how else are they going to learn? And that really gets to something that's very important that, I would like to mention is teaching, security as a 101 course for developers. I think, I've talked to a few educators, and trying to get that education into the programming curriculum has been somewhat difficult traditionally because security tends to be viewed as someone else's issue to work through. I think we're starting to see some of that curriculum be introduced, which I think is very important, because trying to bolt on the security after the fact is very difficult, if not impossible. So I'd love to see more and more programming curriculums include that.
So I agree. I think it's really good. I absolutely agree on the pain or the feedback loop there. The people having to put the work should be the ones also feeling the pain. I think the delta in my mind is that this is a very app-centric view of security, right? I'd compare it to in security, people that talk like, oh, is it a malicious file? And it's like, yeah, cool. File can be malicious. Yeah, that's good. But there's a lot more than just files, right? Like not everything's files. And so the way I think about it is, I think it makes sense to have that feedback loop, or to have those people working from the perspective of like, hey, built the app, and like, hey, this app got an issue in production. The remainder of the security task spectrum, the actual investigation, I think, is a much broader scope, right? it's going to be really hard to take a Java developer who's kind of investigating, like, hey, how somebody exploited some logic bug in their app, to then go and say, oh, okay, you're going to start looking for people dumping credentials out of LSAS in your domain controller. Like, whoa, like that's a day and night, right? So I think in my mind, like that part of the spectrum is the most challenging one to going back to the topic, to kind of try to find the people that do have that developer background, because I think it's still super important to understand software. But then to also bring them, still inch them into the engineering approach, right? Because I think those guys, those are that's the last part of the spectrum that truly is not used to that engineering approach, right? I think the secure app development is it's probably the leading edge in security, and those guys are the trailing edge very much. So yeah, I don't know, what's the best way to really trigger and push in that part of it.
So somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70% of publicly reported incidents can be traced back to an application security problem, not an infrastructure security problem. Mm-hmm. And so traditionally we've overinvested in infrastructure security. That the vast majority of this spend at Comcast when I started was infrastructure. In fact, I think there were 5 people out of 400 working in pure AppSec. And so I still think we have a long way to go to have the investment conversation focus sort of be equal to the actual risk that's happening out there. But you're right. So it's only 70%. That leaves 30%. You're never gonna get away from that 30%, right? There's always going to be something that's related to that. So
yeah. The investment topic is a blanket. Completely agree.
I mean, the other thing, I don't know if anybody else saw the article that came out this week, or may have been last week, talking about, threat actors are actually, it takes them 15 minutes to start scanning for vulnerabilities after they're disclosed. So that window of time to find these things, address them, is becoming to a point where we can't address them fast enough. So, I don't know what we do there other than try to architect this stuff securely from the beginning, or have some continuous monitoring to try to identify when there is a vulnerability with these apps.
Yeah, and that's I don't want to be an ad for my company, but we have a product that's a runtime application self-protection product, and anyone who had that running on their application when Log4Shell hit or Spring4Shell hit, they were pre-protected. So there was no waiting on a web application firewall signature update and testing and distribution. No, basically those attacks got blocked because we were looking for the pattern of data that came from an untrusted source, like, an API call, got to a dangerous sink like a shell command without being properly sanitized. And so we're embedded inside the application. It's very hard to do that outside the application. So that's why sort of an inside the application approach sort of is what we've taken at my company.
Earlier, we talked about the push-pull inside of organizations between, business interests and then security interests, right? And I think we all agree that's there. I think we all agree that the engineering approach is the right way forward. But I also see like a push-pull in that space between, the talent shortage that I think exists in dev and cybersecurity for experienced people that can do this kind of work. And that approach, which is better in the long run, but you can't find people to fill seats versus, this black box solution where the guy just sits there and pushes buttons. So, to move towards this future, we need to be able to have people to do the work. How do we bridge that? How do we make it more interesting? How do we educate people? What's the trick?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
It's a very bland statement, and I feel bad for saying it, but that's where in my mind, both education and maturity, and I think those two things are very related in the sense that the people that we are producing out of training programs, right? So the people coming into the industry, we need to raise the floor of their knowledge as they come into the industry. I'll kind of make an example, but there's I don't know, like 10 years ago, there's no way to learn about this, and if you did, you would learn about the really, really, really deep fundamentals, right? Like, hey, what's a buffer overflow? I remember hearing vaguely about that in university, and that's good, that's fine, but for us to accelerate as an industry, we have to bring this kind of very basic knowledge to be to move those entry positions from like, hey, I know what a buffer overflow is, to, hey, I know what the best practices are to prevent those buffer overflows, and to just keep cranking that up so that I don't think we're going to triple the number of people coming into the industry. I don't think the solution is to just get more warm bodies. It's really to get people that are able to, that have the inherent knowledge to be able to bring more value when they come into those positions. I compare it a little bit to math, right? Many hundreds of years ago, like before calculus, some very basic math was what you would probably graduate, from a university. And then now we teach calculus in high school. And those people coming out of high school have that knowledge. So I think it's that same kind of like cranking up maturity of people coming out so that they don't have to relearn kind of all of the basics on the job.
Yeah, I like that. I basically think of that as sort of a twist on the idea of work smarter, not harder. But at an organizational level, not at an individual level. So when I go in and I meet with a new organization and I get helping them transform to this sort of engineering-centric approach, basically one of the things I tell them is you have more than enough headcount now. And matter of fact, if we're successful, you will be able to reduce your overall headcount. You just have the wrong skill mix right now. And so you're going to have to basically not backfill with the same exact kind of role. You're going to have to backfill with this new kind of role. And you may even have to reduce force if the natural attrition is not being fast enough for your transformation. I think the bigger shortage is the developer shortage. I think that's the one that is, and that one I think is more conducive to sort of some of what you said, Max, in that you can get more and more people to learn how to do that at an earlier age over time, but it's going to take a long time to do that.
Joe, you're much more in the trenches. Are you seeing, like, is it hard to hire people to fill analyst roles?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm seeing are some self-imposed restrictions by the organizations. There are some really kind of fascinating, you see it on LinkedIn a lot too. This is an entry-level job, and they're looking for a CISSP and looking for all these other things, right? But we've got a lot of talent. There are some talent out there, but it may not be exactly going to be an exact fit for your organization. And in those cases, I think you have to take what you can get, coach up those people that are worth it. I mean, back in the day, that's what we used to have to do. University, unfortunately, there's lag time. It's a long train, right? By the time the education gets approved and gets rolled out, the industry's moved. So there's going to be people that come through university that aren't necessarily ready, and that's okay. It's not their fault. It's not university's fault. It's just the way it is. And then there are a lot of people that have, maybe they did a liberal arts thing. They didn't know what they wanted to be when they grew up. But I tell you, some of those people that I've worked with, that were English majors or Spanish majors, have blown me away from app dev, networking capacity. They just had a skill set they didn't know they had. And it takes people that have good soft skills, good all these other things. So let's start looking at, what the talent might be with those folks and bring them up to where we need them to be. That's just my feeling on it. And oftentimes, I think they check the boxes, right? Do they have this certification? Do they have this? That's not what we need right now. We need, to get some qualified people in and start getting them coached up.
Smart people who are able to learn fast and have good soft skills, and coach them up and have a program for doing that in your organization. I think that's a smart move.
And I think that goes back full circle to one of the very first topics that we were talking around. This not magic, but like the where the imagination, where creativity comes in. That's what those people have in my mind, right? Like that's the spark that they find something that is really interesting about this topic, and that's the thing we don't want to kill through standardization, right? So it's kind of like finding that middle ground of going. I'm kind of curious, Joe, to hear. Do you ever work with, or do you ever hear about the sort of like the trade-off from people that might say, hey, we have trouble, finding people and hiring for this. Should we go and work with a company that does, that has those people? Like I'm thinking essentially MSSPs. How often do you see this analysis being done by companies that have trouble finding it?
Yeah, I have seen that. So typically the customers we're working with are small to mid-sized manufacturers where they just don't have the talent in-house. So they are having to go outside and leverage that. So, obviously I'm an advocate of that. In my past, that's what I've helped small organizations where they didn't have the talent inside to do that. So I think it depends on the organization and depends upon obviously what needs they have, but if they don't have the appetite for the spend, reach out and get a partnership with another organization that can help bring that in immediately. I think would be hugely beneficial.
And Larry, do you think that is a direction that is happening, that is a good thing that's happening? Do you see a consolidation movement like that where it turns out not everybody should be able to kind of do all of these activities? How do you feel about that dynamic?
Well, I mean, I guess I go back to the sort of skills mix. I feel like if you're just looking for people that are out of the box, can already have all of this sort of security specialist knowledge. I think you need to design a system, a setup, a way of working that doesn't depend upon having lots of those people. And that's essentially been the flavor of it. Now it does depend on having a supply of Scrum Master and developer types though. So, a shortage there affects me. And there is consolidation. Engineers are getting more and more skilled, but they're getting more cognitive prosthetics. I like to refer to tools like IDEs as a cognitive prosthetic, and an application security testing tool like Contrast is a cognitive prosthetic. They don't have to know in detail what an SQL injection is. If we can detect it and we can link them to a 2 to 3 minute video that shows them what it is after it's been detected in the code they wrote, that's all we really need to be able to do. They don't have to have known that in advance.
Yeah, and I want to be clear too that outsourcing, I want to make sure that may not solve your issues, right? It doesn't come without its set of challenges. I will say, there are certain trade-offs to outsourcing versus insourcing that talent. So, I think that's up to the organization to really determine that. But, don't think that outsourcing is going to solve all your issues necessarily, but it is an option that you can consider.
It helps. I think the best places for that are the things that are nicely siloed or conveniently siloed, like pen testing and threat modeling. Things that are after the fact already. It's very hard to outsource and also do an engineering-centric approach. You can outsource all of your development, but and then expect them to produce secure code. Yeah, that would work. But it's very hard to have in-house development and outsource security and be engineering-centric about it. That doesn't work very well.
Yeah, and I love the approach of having a second set of eyes, of the scripting or development, the very small amount that I've done, oftentimes, it's hard to see the code and seeing the flaws within your code, right? You look at it and you stare at it all the time. What in the world? Why is this not working? By having a second set of eyes that's outside of that group, maybe even outside of the organization, might be beneficial.
Cool. Well, we're almost at time. I'm going to throw one more out there and see what you guys think of it. So, ripping and replacing everything that a company has today is probably not an option for everybody. But like, what are some like first steps? I know, Larry, you have a framework. I'm going to go look that up after. But just like for the people watching us today, what's like a first step? What's the thing to think about as you try and navigate towards this brighter future? And I can pick somebody if.
I think we'll all have very different answers because we have very different lenses onto the problem, right? So I'll throw mine in. So I come from a vendor / operations perspective, right? My career, I've built security tools and I've done operations, and I think for me, that step is more like a general goal. So which is, if you are dealing with, pants on fire, like Larry was saying, of, operations day to day, is to start picking, scoping and picking at things that you can do today so that you don't have to do it tomorrow. Right. The idea is you want to start building the foundation of how you run your operations, how you detect things, how you respond to things, how you detect vulnerabilities. Right. SQL injection happened. OK, how do we, I know we're responding to this today, but how do we do one little step that next time I won't have to take? And I think that's kind of like it's much more philosophical, but like that sets you on that road of starting to think about this as a way that you're constantly getting better and not just always just fighting the same fires.
I actually, the different perspectives, I think that's a great first step for sort of an individual app team. So I'm going to actually answer it from the org perspective, which has multiple teams, multiple apps. So the very first step in my recommendation is to get the 3 to 5 most respected engineers in the organization. These are the coolest engineers. These are the ones that all the other engineers really want to be like. They're working on the projects that everybody wished they were working on. And when they got all the tools and the tech stack that everybody wishes they had. And get those 3 to 5 people in the room with the security group. And don't let them out of the room. It takes about half a day of facilitation to do this. But don't let them out of the room until they have an ordered list where they've weighted. This is 50% of the problem. This is 20% of the problem. This is 5% of the problem. An ordered, weighted list of just simple, granular practices that they think development teams or engineering teams can take ownership, start to do in less than 90 days per thing, and come out with that list and have it be agreed upon. You can use the PCI list or the NIST list or whatever to start with. But really, it has to be your list, and it has to be weighted for your context. And it has to be something written in a way that the engineering folks want. The beauty of this approach is that those 3 to 5 people, they created the list or they participated in creating the list. They will then advocate for it when you go to spread it to the rest of the engineering organization.
A little social engineering for the engineering team, then.
You got it. It's exactly what it is. But you also get practices written in a way that makes sense to developers, right? Like if you read NIST or PCI standard, a lot of the way they use the same terms are different, have a different connotation to an engineer than the same exact word has to a security specialist. And so they scratch their head. It's like, we do that already. Well, I don't understand. They're basically missing some gap. But if you do it this way, you force those sort of subtle differences in wording to get resolved, and you come up with a wording that's really geared towards the engineering team.
Yeah, that's great. Joe, did you have something to throw in on that one?
No, I completely agree with what Larry's saying too. When you look at the NIST framework, there's, depending upon the lens, how you want to look at it, right? You can interpret those things in many different ways, but there is very specific language. But, the way I would approach it would probably mirror a lot of what was already said, which is, start with leadership, get that buy-in for how the approach is going to be taken. It should be a strategic approach, right? That's risk-based, and then start rolling in practices, standards, and particular approaches to coding while you run in parallel to your old application, because you're going to have to still maintain that till you get to the desired result, right? So to me, that's the way to do it, and using some sort of framework to kind of step through that process, because it's going to be way too big and it's going to be painful. So what small steps can you make that are smart and that are going to net the best results the quickest is probably the better way to go, and it's going to result in a success in the end.
That was some great advice I had from an old CTO I work for. It's eat the elephant one bite at a time. I guess start with the tastiest parts. Thank you guys so much for this. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think some really interesting stuff came out of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate everybody.
Thanks for pulling us together, and it's a pleasure meeting you, Joe and Max.
Yeah.
Same here.
Pleasure of mine. Thank you.
Okay.